Well, today we're confronted with an interesting dilemma for the United States of America. Two men are nose to nose. Actually, Clinton's, I think, in Europe talking to Kohl in Germany, and Netanyahu has arrived in America. So it's interesting, but they're nose to nose, face to face, and there's a confrontation. Bill Clinton is the president of the most powerful nation in the world. Bibi Netanyahu is the prime minister of one of the smallest countries in the world. And it would seem that this confrontation wouldn't be taking place, that the United States of America would easily have its way. But that is not the case, and in fact, over the last 50 years, the United States of America has developed a Middle Eastern policy that may or may not be consistent with the vested interests of the United States of America or the long-run interests of the nations in the Middle East. And I want to reflect on that by first turning to the fact that the United States of America at the beginning of this century became something that Americans are always proud of, but they're not quite sure what it means. We became a world power, in fact, in time, the dominant power on this planet. And the power of the United States of America rests first on an event which eliminated some of its rivals, which undermined the British Empire and the French Empire. That was World War I. It was after 1918 that the United States of America emerged as perhaps the dominant power in the world, and that was supported by the incredible industry of the United States of America. The power of America doesn't lie primarily in its army. It lies in the fact that it can manufacture things for war and things for armies, but ultimately the wealth and the prosperity of this nation, as well as its considerable population. Among people or nations with European populations, the United States of America was among the largest. And it had developed ever since the Civil War and through the Spanish-American War, and in particular because of World War I, it had developed a credible and significant military, both Army and Navy. But the crowning moment to prove the hegemony and the power of the United States of America was the renewal of World War I in World War II. The same enemy, Germany, an added enemy, Japan, and the ultimate triumph, and the triumph of American technology is demonstrated in the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? I mean, that was so. The Russians hadn't yet developed the atom bomb. Nations all over the world are still trying to do that. I mean, India's in the news. But there was America with the most powerful weapon in the world, the most powerful industry in the world, the most prosperous country in the world. Its population was smaller than that of India or China, but there was no doubt about it. America was a world power. So when you talk about America, she now enters into the world. You can't talk about America simply as a domestic power. America enters into foreign relations, and American foreign relations determine what happens around the world. Now, from the beginning of this strong awareness, certainly after World War II, America had to contend with certain problems in terms of its role as a world power. One, and it's still there, it goes all the way back to the 19th century, to the idea that the United States of America should have nothing at all to do with nations across the oceans. And that was possible because it was very hard to get to us or to attack us. The idea is called isolationism. Americans should be concerned with America and shouldn't be concerned with other nations. Now that, of course, is a self-defeating thing because the industry and prosperity of the United States of America rests on trade and commerce with with other nations, with a connection. Unless you want to undermine that trade and commerce, you have to be engaged in foreign policy. The second was the emergence after World War II of the terrible Cold War, the battle with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union rose as a challenger to the United States of America, and now the United States of America was engaged in a long-run program that lasted until 1991 to contain Russia. And there were various fronts for that. I mean, there was the European front, there was the Asiatic front, and there was the Middle Eastern front, and the whole point was to what? Hold it in, to contain the Soviet Union. One of the problems, obviously, that emerged was that the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, which limited the intimidation power of the United States of America. And last, and very important and affecting an area that we now call the Middle East to a large degree is the Muslim world, Western Asia and Northern Africa, was the dependency of American industry on a carbon fuel called oil. That is, the American economy no longer ran on coal. It ran on oil. Its army ran on oil. And therefore, the United States of America couldn't be isolationist because its whole economy rested on oil. And for those of us who remember the oil crisis in 1973, we understand that. So here is this thing. It's annoying. That is, America does not control in its own territory one of the most powerful resources it needs for the maintenance of its economy. And the greatest centers of oil, which emerged at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the discoveries, lay in the Middle East, in the areas that were the former territories either of Persia or the Ottoman Empire. We call that the Muslim world, the Middle East. And so the interest of the United States of America in the Middle East wasn't trivial. I mean, it wasn't like, well, the scenery's pretty. It was vital. We could not afford that this land, this territory, this area should fall into the hands of the enemy. So, and the enemy after World War II was the Soviet Union. How do you keep the Soviet Union out of the Middle East? I mean, they're right there. Russia bordered Iran and bordered Turkey, bordered Afghanistan. It wasn't many miles away from the major oil resources that the United States of America needed. So this became a vital issue in American foreign policy, and it triggered all kinds of responses. I mean, the response to the containment policy that was the United States of America created alliances. She found allies who benefited from their connection to the United States of America. America provided them with weapons, and they were also afraid of the Soviet Union. The most powerful alliance was in Europe, called NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. With that, West Germany was revived, and now they stood against the Soviet Union, part of this containment policy. In Southeast Asia, SEATO was developed, putting together whatever nations there were to confront China, which ultimately joined the Soviet Union. And of course, Japan became a major ally of the United States of America and remains so. We still have important military bases in Japan. But the third and most important one, where the United States of America felt most vulnerable in some respects, was the Middle East. So she did create CENTO. she found a series of allies. They included Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, and they were supposed to be the what? The bulwark against the Soviet Union. Certainly, one of the responses that was done was the development of the United States Army and Navy. Right? We spent a lot of money in the Cold War on our Army and Navy. We kept it big. It was the largest item. Today it's welfare. I mean, well, today it's public services, but I mean, at one time it was the Army. Remember, the military was a big thing of dispute, certainly among liberals, how all this money spent on the military, but it was spent on the military. And that was one of the ways that America maintained itself as strong. A third was to give subsidies to poor nations as long as they would side with us. So we gave a lot of money. I mean, we gave money to Turkey. We gave money to Iraq, although the British at that time were the major supporters. We gave money to nations in Europe, the Marshall Plan. We gave all these subsidies. That was the way to reinforce the containment policy. We then organized the United Nations, which we controlled for many years. It was an instrument of the United States. The United States could count on the majority of votes in the General Assembly. And in fact, the power of the United States, I mean, the Russians by accident had stalked out of the Security Council at the time that the Korean War began, and the United States got the UN to what? To support the assault against the North Koreans. And above all, the United States established military bases all around the periphery of the Soviet Union, whether in Japan or in Saudi Arabia, where a lot of the oil was to be found, or in the countries of Western Europe. It used to be a lot of fun to be in the American Army or Navy. You could go all over the world. You go to Italy, you go to Germany, you could go to France, you could go to Japan. You could see the world. Today it's more limited in terms of your options when you're involved with the military. Now, from the very beginning, problems occurred. The backup for the United States of America's containment policy were the leftover British and French empires. That is, almost all of Africa was in the hands of two allies of the United States of America called, I mean, they were the British colonies and the French colonies. They were all over the Middle East and the underbelly of Asia. And then in the 50s and the 60s, Britain and France, unable to hold on to their empires, allowed these nations to become independent. Well, that now exposed the containment policy to nations who hated colonialism, identified colonialism with European powers, and European powers were allied to the United States of America. Certainly the great confrontation, the final denouement of the British Empire, the end, was in 1956, when Nasser seized the Suez Canal. The British and the French and the Israelis what? Came down, invaded Egypt and said, no, you're not going to do that. And President Eisenhower of the United States of America ordered them back. And the reward, of course, was that Gamal Abdel Nasser did not become an ally of the United States of America. He became an ally of the Soviet Union. Now to have, I mean, here you have the boundary, the containment, but behind the containment now is the enemy. So the policy is now beginning to shake. And then all over Africa, which is behind the lines too, are all these African countries, Lumumba and the Congo, and people from Ethiopia to Ghana, all demanding liberation against the colonialists, and America was identified as an ally of the colonialists. So this was a frightening thing. Certainly, one of the problems was the fact that China, in 1949, fell to the communists, and that provoked, in 1950, the Korean War, because with China behind it, and the Soviet Union, the North Koreans invaded South Korea, and the net result was the Korean War, which led to a humiliating truce for the United States of America. It was no victory, and in fact compromised the reputation of the United States of America. And then the United States lost the UN. It lost the UN because the General Assembly was now filled up with all these new nations who had been liberated from the British and French Empire and who were now voting anti-American. And then came the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War affected the ability of the United States to enforce its foreign policy and to appear strong in foreign policy, because the morale of the American people in support of their government was undermined. But certainly one of the most important problems for the United States of America was the emergence in 1948, 50 years ago, it's the 50th year this year, of the State of Israel. Now, the United States of America State Department had not planned their policies for the Middle East with the State of Israel. It was an intrusion. It came out of another issue that seemed unrelated to the vested interests of the United States of America in the Middle East. But the creation of Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel after the end of World War II provoked turmoil in the area, in the Arab and Muslim areas where the oil was. And in fact, it was because of the emergence of Israel that the government of King Farouk in Egypt, which at least was moderate and manageable, was replaced by the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who became an ally of the Soviet Union and who now sought to unify the entire Arab world, replacing Arab governments that were pro-American, including the government of Saudi Arabia, where what? The major oil resources were. Now, that was a major problem. It became an issue in the State Department. There were those people in the State Department who said, I mean, don't go crazy. The vested interest of the United States of America is to hang on to the oil resources. And therefore, what we need to do is to cultivate the Arab countries. And then there was the opposition, which wasn't to be found so much in the State Department as either in the office of the president or in the Democratic and Republican parties or in the people outside, who were responding to the nature of the American electorate. But now there was Israel. Now, Israel was a very interesting state. By the way, it's very small. The amount of territory it has is somewhere around 10,000 square miles. Got it? Michigan is 57,000 square miles. All right, so now you're talking about 1/5 the size of the state of Michigan, and when it started, it had approximately 600,000 Jews and 200,000 Arabs. Got it? It's got 800,000 people. The population of the state of Michigan today is around 10 million. Got this popularity? And what is intriguing is that this state has remained on the front page of most newspapers. No, I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. There are other states far bigger and whatever that don't remain at the center, but in fact, Israel was at the center of the politics of the Middle East, and the Middle East was not a trivial area, it was a vital area. Now, Israel has had many accomplishments, so let me try to talk about the connection of the United States to Israel. Israel's support from the United States came from three great things. One, and that was the counterforce certainly to the State Department. One was the enormous guilt felt by the United States and people around the world, and sympathy with regard to the tragedy of the Holocaust. I mean, that was a major factor. Without the Holocaust, it is doubtful that the State of Israel would have come into existence. And second was the fact that the largest Jewish community in the world lived in the United States of America. And they were educated and articulate, and they lived in crucial states that were important for victory, whether they were New York or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts or California or whatever. Their voting against a party could defeat it, or their voting for a party in these critical states could make it. And so one of the reasons, obviously, was the influence and power of American Jews, and that was very critical, certainly in the minds of people like President Truman. The third was the fact that Israelis could be understood more by Americans than the Arabs. The Arabs belonged to the Muslim world. They were like alien. Israelis were Europeans, and they had European culture. And therefore, if Israelis came to this country and they spoke like what? Like Europeans. So Americans could identify more with Israel. But certainly one of the things that sealed the alliance, because America made a choice. She became the ally, a powerful ally of the State of Israel. That is, there were various options. There were people in the State Department saying what? Don't. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't conform to the vested interests of the United States of America. But there were these counter forces that supported the alliance with Israel. But the thing that clinched it was in 1967. Prior to 1967, America was an ally, but not, in some cases, the most important ally of Israel. The first and very powerful ally of Israel, interestingly enough, just for a very short while, only lasted about 3 months, was the Soviet Union. They viewed America as supportive of the oil interests in the Middle East. They assumed that Israel, because it was a socialist state, at that time the government of Israel was the Labor Party and it was committed officially to socialism, would be sympathetic to the Soviet Union. So it was Stalin who authorized the Czechs, whose country he occupied, to send arms to the Israelis, without which they would never have won the War of Independence. They didn't win the War of Independence because of help from the United States of America. They won the War of Independence because they got arms from Czechoslovakia. And those arms were authorized by the man who controlled Czechoslovakia. His name is Joe Stalin. But he soon fell out of love with Israel. When he saw that the establishment of the State of Israel was not going to lead necessarily to a socialist Middle East, and that the establishment of the state was arousing the Jews of the Soviet Union, he turned against Israel and then became a what? A violent opponent. The second and major ally that was the ally almost up until 1967, until 1962, was France. The French shared with the Israelis an agenda. They were fighting the Arabs in Algeria. And therefore, they and the Israelis were together. That's why in 1956, the French and the Israelis and the British could cooperate in the invasion of Egypt. And the French supplied the Israelis with arms. Now, America through this period was not hostile, but she wasn't the major ally. What made her the major ally was something that happened in 1967 when the American army in Vietnam was being defeated. The Israelis in 6 days defeated the ally of the Soviet Union, Gamal Abdel Nasser. And it was therefore very clear that although this nation was very small and its population was very small, it had an incredibly powerful army that was now anti-Soviet. America was anti-Soviet, so Israel could be used as part of the what? The anti-Soviet containment policy of the United States of America. So the vested interests of Israel and the vested interests of the United States of America came together. And in fact, after 1967, the administrations of America changed from Democratic to Republican. The Republican Party had not been overwhelmingly sympathetic to the establishment of the State of Israel. But now, with Nixon and Reagan, the alliance between Israel and the United States became even stronger. Now, from the beginning, the alliance produced trouble for the United States. First of all, the Soviet Union continued to expand, and it wanted to expand into the Middle East. The second was that Great Britain and France changed their mind. De Gaulle changed his mind. Remember, De Gaulle was going to fight the Arabs, and then he what? That's how he came to power in Algeria, and then he said, we'll make peace. So he made peace with Arabs, and he then liberated the French colonies in Africa. And now his policy was not to support Israel, but to support the Arabs. Now, France was an ally of the United States of America in NATO. But now de Gaulle was saying that's a foolish policy. In fact, he said nasty things about Israel. So now America lost the support of one of its major allies in what we call the Israeli alliance. And then Great Britain went through the same experience. Its hostility was not as articulated as that of France. But obviously, America wasn't receiving support for this alliance from either Britain or France. And then it was complicated by the fact that America needed military bases in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was an ally of the United States of America, but Saudi Arabia had the largest known oil reserves at that time. America needed that oil, and Saudi Arabia was violently anti-Zionist and violently anti-Israel. So, how do you maintain, if you're doing this containment policy, how do you maintain an alliance with two allies that what? Hate each other. And then one, by virtue of the alliance with Israel and other troubles, countries that had been sympathetic to the United States of America, given over to revolutionaries who used anti-Zionism as part of their program, took over countries in the Middle East and made them allies of the Soviet Union. In 1958, the pro-American government of Iraq was overthrown, and the great scream and the propaganda, whatever had to do with anti-Zionism and Israel and all of that, and now Iraq became an ally of the Soviet Union. Algeria was lost to the French, and the government of Algeria that emerged after 1962 and 1963 was violently anti-American, and part of its propaganda was directed toward Israel. And then in 1969, the pro-American government of Libya, using anti-Zionist propaganda led by Muammar Gaddafi, who's still there, right, was overthrown, and an anti-American and anti-Israeli government took over in Libya. And then in 1979, one of the bulwarks of American Middle East policy, as long as it stood, it did not seem possible for the Arab world to become overwhelmingly dangerous, but one of the bulwarks, Iran, was taken over by Ayatollah Khomeini with what? Fierce anti-Zionist and anti-Israeli propaganda. Syria, which had been sort of in the middle by the 1960s, fell under the control of the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'ath Party was violently anti-Zionist, violently anti-Israel, and violently anti-American. And ultimately Syria, falling under the control of a man called Assad, became an ally of the Soviet Union. And people in the State Department were saying, this alliance with the State of Israel is not producing a credible American security in the Middle East. And then a civil war broke out in Lebanon. That's 1975. The net result was that the Syrian army moved into Lebanon, so did the Israeli army ultimately. And in the end, the Israeli army withdrew, and Lebanon now falls into the hands of Syria, which is an ally of the Soviet Union. And all of that is compounded by the fact that the Israeli military, which was stunning in 1967, now experiences military reverses. The Yom Kippur War in 1973, and in the Lebanon War in 1982. And to top it all, there now appears this phenomenon called terrorism, Palestinian terrorism, which is directed not only toward Israel, but toward Israel's major ally, the United States of America. And the anti-Americanism now fuels another force, a force in the Arab world and in the Muslim world that we call fundamentalism, which says the great evil of the world is the United States of America, its capitalism and its materialism and its secularism, and the agent of the United States of America in the Middle East is Israel. Oh. And then, at the time that Iran was taken over, the Soviet Union invades a country right next to Iran called Afghanistan, and a civil war breaks out. And then, 10 years later, south of Egypt, a major Arab country, with sticking into the center of Africa, the Sudan, is taken over by Muslim fundamentalists, who basically, this is 1989, who repudiate any connection with the United States of America. By that time, they don't seek an alliance with the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union is falling apart. Well, so the whole containment policy of the United States of America in the Middle East is what? It's in deep trouble. So America has to cope. How does it cope? Well, the way America coped, of course, was to recognize that the Arab world was not unified, that you could play one Arab power off against another. Morocco was very worried about the radical government in Algeria, right? So America moved into Morocco, made friends with the king of Morocco. So Morocco became an ally of the United States of America because the Moroccans were indeed afraid of Algeria and what was going on in the Arab radical world. She hung on to a country that was very important to her. It became an ally of the United States of America because the Turks feared the Soviet Union. They bordered on the Soviet Union and they wanted American protection. But Turkey also borders on the Arab world. And the Turks remained a bulwark. American bases in Turkey, the Turkish army, very important to hang on to Turkey because if they lost Turkey, it would be all gone. One of the countries they picked up was Pakistan. India, the government of India, the socialist government of India, in its hostility certainly to Britain, the British Empire, and to the ally of the British Empire, the United States of America, had chosen to receive support from the Russians. And so the Pakistanis, who were the remaining part of India that had not been incorporated into Hindu India, Muslim India turned into a country all its own, was now open to receiving help. And in fact, they contacted the Americans contacted them, and so there was Turkey over here and there was Pakistan over there. And then something very fortunate happened to the United States of America. After Nasser died, the man who succeeded him was Anwar Sadat. And Anwar Sadat was very smart. He recognized that an alliance with the Soviet Union gets you nothing. The Soviet Union had nothing to give Egypt. In the end, the Egyptian economy could not be revived with the Soviet Union. The socialist policies of Gamal Abdel Nasser had not worked. And America then took advantage of disunity in the Arab world. She cultivated Egypt, and in fact it was Sadat who made the trip to Israel. One of the most important stabilizing forces, because had it not occurred, I'm not quite sure what would have happened. One of the most stabilizing forces in the Middle East, certainly from the American point of view, was the fact that Anwar Sadat was willing to make peace with Israel. The price for Israel was one that even the most conservative party was willing to pay. It was the Sinai Peninsula. What were you going to do with the Sinai Peninsula? So they gave up the Sinai Peninsula, and now Israel had peace on its most important border because Egypt was the largest and most powerful Arab country. Sadat, meanwhile, was alienated from the rest of the Arab world that repudiated him for making this peace. But it was a coping strategy. And the last thing was the Israelis had an idea. The Israeli idea, which turned into Irangate, was that Persians hate Arabs. So even though the government of Iran says it hates Israel, it hates Arabs more. So if the American government makes contact with the Iranians, do you understand? Maybe the Iranians would be willing clandestinely or secretly to reverse its policies. It might, with American help, be of use to the Americans, and although it would never be the Shah, it could still be what? Helpful. Well, that turned into a grand fiasco with no sex. All right. Now, the reinforcement of this coping strategy, and the coping strategy involved the maintenance of the alliance with Israel. And the maintenance of the alliance with Israel was done by trying to paste together some way to continue this containment policy, and it was reinforced by certain things. One, the continuing terrorism going on all over the world, which frightened not only Israelis but also Americans. The incredible anti-Americanism now that spread throughout the Persian and the Arab worlds. So that, I mean, the denunciations of America were overwhelming. The third, the strong and very powerful lobby created by Jewish organizations who legitimately believed that the survival of the state of Israel was important and was consistent with the best interests of the United States of America. The emergence in America of a political force that turned out to be more pro-Israeli than the Jews. Let me mention them to you. They're still around. I think Netanyahu is going to talk to them. They're called Christian fundamentalists. You may remember that toward the end of the 70s, there arose Jerry Falwell. And the early 80s, there was Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority and Pat Robertson. Now they are politically organizing. Well, they are Christian fundamentalists. They read their Bible. And in the Old Testament it says, God has given the land of Israel, all of it, to the Jews. And in fact, Christ can't even come back a second time until the Jews have what? Basically been returned to the land. So now there was this religious movement in the United States of America. They kept sending people over to Israel, kiss, 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 love, love, love. But they're a powerful political force in the United States of America, not in the Democratic Party, but in the Republican Party. And if you listen to some of the leaders of the Christian religious right, they are more pro-Israeli, no matter what the Israeli government decides, than many parts of the American Jewish community. It's an interesting development, and they now became a force in America to support the alliance. One of the reasons why it was maintained, of course, was that the Soviet Union was weakening. After the invasion of Afghanistan, it was very clear what? This country was falling apart. It was just rotten inside. And by the end of the 70s, I mean the end of the 80s, Mikhail Gorbachev showed up, right, to try to reform things, but the decay was too thick. So as the Soviet Union declined, the necessity of providing a very, very strong containment declined. And, of course, one of the major things, of course, which has kept the price of oil down, is they have found oil all over the world. Not in Michigan. No, there is a little, no. There's a little bit in Michigan. No, there is. I mean, up, I don't know, somewhere. Some people tell me they've got an oil well somewhere in Michigan, but it's not big in Michigan. All right. So that's our luck. But oil everywhere. Nigeria, ooh, a lot of American oil comes from Nigeria, in Africa. There are places all over the world, Venezuela, whatever it be. So the dependence of the United States of America on Middle Eastern oil was not eliminated. It's still very dependent on that oil, but what? It diminished, it sort of eased up the problem, and the world oil crisis seemed to be less of a crisis. And then occurred the Great Reversal. So let me talk about the reversal. The reversal took place between 1989 and 1993. From 1967 until 1989, the alliance between the United States of America and Israel was what? Firm. No matter what the provocations were, it held, and America developed a coping strategy that allowed them to maintain that alliance. But between 1989 and 1993, there was a reversal. The beginning of the reversal, of course, was the collapse of the communist world. The first sign of that was toward the end of the 1970s when China suddenly decided it liked capitalism. I look at now at the photographs of people in Beijing and Shanghai, and I've been there. I mean, I could be looking at a very prosperous, capitalistic country when you look at the so-called rising bourgeoisie of this country. I mean, China, which was one of the bulwarks of the system, China, which was the reason for the Vietnam War, I mean, China goes. And then the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Boris Yeltsin, who was still the president of Russia, dissolved the Soviet Union and fired the Communist Party. Well, the whole reason for the alliance with Israel was based on two things. One, the politics in the United States of America, and the fact that Israel was perceived as an anti-Soviet military force. But if there's no Soviet Union to fight, so now that collapsed, and then the United States of America emerged in 1991 as the hegemonic power in the world. Even the Russians were listening to it. The Americans said something, the Russians what? Responded. It was now clear that the United States didn't need a containment policy. There was nothing to contain. It was suddenly given the world. But then, America was confronted with another problem, because the fall of the Soviet Union did not eliminate anti-Americanism in the world. In fact, one of the strongest sources of anti-Americanism in the world, which had festered for many, many decades, was in the Middle East. It had been fueled by the American alliance with Israel, not caused by it. It's called Muslim fundamentalism, which now emerged in the eyes of the State Department and the government of the United States as the major threat to American vested interests, because Muslim fundamentalists lived astride the oil resources which were indispensable to the United States of America. So the Soviet threat goes, and the Muslim fundamentalist threat arises, and then in 1987, inside of Israel, a rebellion breaks out on the part of the Palestinian Arabs, which we call the Intifada, which Israel suppresses but not overwhelmingly successfully. So now the American government's in a new ball game. The Cold War is over, the post-Cold War. And the alliance with Israel was a function of the Cold War. The time it happened was a Republican administration. The president was George Bush. The Secretary of State was Jim Baker. And by that time, in fact, thousands and thousands of Jewish people who had historically voted Democratic ever since Roosevelt had now reversed themselves and were voting for the Republican Party. They liked the policies of Nixon and Reagan, in particular with regard to the Middle East. And now the Secretary of State of that party, Jim Baker, in the minds of many of those in favor of the alliance, turns against Israel. The game has changed. And Jim Baker now says to Israel, his policy, look, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. We are still your ally. But now we have to prevent Muslim fundamentalists from taking over the Middle East. It is not in the interest of the United States of America to have Muslim fundamentalists in control of the Middle East. And therefore, since your inability to make peace with the Palestinians, or their unwillingness, whatever, to make peace with you, whatever it be, is a source of provocation that makes fundamentalism grow, and because we want to cultivate an alliance with all the Arab and Muslim powers that are moderate, you're going to have to make peace. So now Baker applied pressure. And in fact, he was supported by the possibility that Arab moderate countries were saying, look, we don't want Muslim fundamentalists. Mubarak in Egypt said, we don't want Muslim fundamentalists. You force Israel to make peace and we'll be your friend. And the government of Jordan said the same thing, and whatever else it be. So the pressure continued. There was another thing, and it's rather interesting. It's happened in the United States of America. We used to have the National Conference of Christians and Jews. There are only two major religions. Now it's like something like the National Council of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Over the last 20 years, there has entered into American awareness the fact that there are religions other than Christianity and Judaism in America. There are lots of Hindus around, and there are lots of what? Muslims around. And in fact, as they grow up and become Americanized, they even develop a certain kind of political power all their own. I call it Islam awareness, which gives a certain level of respectability to them, where back in 1948, these people were viewed as absolutely what? Foreign. Now in the American awareness, Islam is not something un-American. It is something like, do you understand, inside the United States of America, and that awareness is increasing. But certainly the Great Revision came as a result of the action of Iraq, misreading the intentions of America. Iraq invades Kuwait and now threatens the oil interests in Saudi Arabia. And the United States of America has to respond, and it does, and in responding, it now develops a new foreign policy. Because in fighting Iraq, it mobilizes most of the Arab world, including a former ally of the Soviet Union, namely Syria. So that's proof to the Bush administration that it is possible for the United States of America to mobilize and bring together all Arabs opposed to Muslim fundamentalism into an alliance. But the price of keeping that alliance together was that Israel must make concessions to the Palestinians. So the pressure on Israel grows. And out of it comes the peace process. In fact, feeling the pressure, the government of Yitzhak Shamir, who was the leader of the Conservative Party in Israel, Likud, ultimately collapses and is replaced by the old Liberal Party, which is called the Labor Party. The leader of that party is Yitzhak Rabin, who can read the handwriting on the wall. It's not like a mystery. The United States of America has altered its foreign policy and its view of the alliance. Out of that comes the Oslo agreements, right? The beginnings of the peace process, and the peace process, which was reinforced by a handshake in 1993, the first year of the Clinton Democratic administration, calls for the withdrawal of Israel over a period of 5 or 6 years from Gaza and the West Bank, with certain revisions in the boundary and with the exclusion of Jerusalem, although the Palestinians insist that would be a matter of negotiation. And the possibility of the creation and development of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And the possibility of peace now not only with Egypt, but now with Jordan. And in fact, 1 year later, Jordan made peace with Israel. And the possibility of peace with Syria. Negotiations began. And with the possibility that Israel might be able to open itself up for trade with the entire Middle East. In fact, America grows very confident. Rabin's in power, the peace process is moving forward, and in fact, to offer reinforcement to its policies in the Middle East, it now begins to cultivate India. And India is very important because India is a message to the Muslim world. India is Hindu. That America has connections, do you understand, beyond the Muslim world, on the border of the Muslim world. And then came the American Great Frustration. First of all, the Gulf War appears to be won, but what? It's not. The ruler of the government in Iraq does not fall. His name is Saddam Hussein. He stays in power. 2, the government of Turkey is now assaulted by Muslim fundamentalists. And in fact, the leader of the Muslim fundamentalists becomes the prime minister of Turkey. Pakistan, angry over American dealings with India, now begins to cozy up to maybe the future enemy of America in the 21st century, China. And now begins to receive help for the manufacture of nuclear weapons. And then terrorism continues. In fact, terrorism arrives in the United States of America, in downtown New York, right? With the bomb in the World Trade Center. And then the worst thing of all, Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated. And what follows is his successor, instead of calling an election immediately, Shimon Peres, waits. And it's a deadly wait, because when the election is finally held in 1996, the party of Yitzhak Rabin, the Labor Party, which was in favor of the peace process, loses. And now a new leader emerges, the leader of the Conservative Party, the new leader that has replaced Yitzhak Shamir, a man by the name of Binyamin Netanyahu, or Bibi Netanyahu. And Bibi Netanyahu has said he is not in favor of the peace process. Now, America is the most powerful nation in the world. So you have to give Bibi Netanyahu credit. Do you understand the power that's behind the United States of America? Bibi Netanyahu is opposed to the peace process. He doesn't care that the vested interests of the United States of America have altered, that the alliance may not appear to the State Department to be as important. Doesn't care. He is a conservative Israeli who believes that the peace process threatens the security of Israel by giving up territory that what Israel needs. That's what he believes. And what he proceeds to do is what many people thought was impossible. He stands up to the President of the United States. He does. And he says, no! No! Now, a confrontation is there. Right? He's been saying no for 2 years. No, no, no. The American government And by the way, the Clinton administration is simply inheriting the policy that was started under the Bush administration, which is the revision of the American policy in the Middle East over a period of 22 years or 24 years. And he's looking at that policy, and he's saying, no. And now two politicians are nose to nose. I mean, they may not be literally, because Clinton's in Germany and he's in America, but I mean, they're what? They are nose to nose. And Netanyahu is confident that he will win. And therefore, the two questions that arise are the following. Would the victory of Netanyahu be good for both the United States and Israel? Right? And two, will he be able to get away with it? He has not been crushed either by the Israelis or by the American government. And if you want to hear what I think about the confrontation, come back in 5 minutes. Let me just now turn to Israel. Israel is celebrating its 50th anniversary as an independent state. On May 14th, 1948, today is May the 14th. All right, so this is the anniversary. I didn't plan it that way. I mean, not according to the Hebrew date, it's not the anniversary, but according to the English date, this is the 50th, or the Roman date. This is the 50th anniversary of the state of Israel, and its successes have been overwhelming. It started out with a population of 600,000. It now has a population of 6 million, 5 million of whom are Jews. And in fact, so it has provided enormous refuge to thousands and thousands and thousands of people, most of whom have come from places of persecution. Two, it has produced a new ethnicity. It has taken European Jews, and it has taken Middle Eastern Jews who were ethnically different, and it has brought them together, and now there is this new blending that we call Israeli. It has done what most other nations haven't been able to do, which is to revive an ancient spoken language and to turn it into the language of the people and the state. It has created democratic institutions, and I do want to say something about its relationship to Great Britain. When Britain departed in 1948, there wasn't much love between the Zionist movement and Great Britain. But the reality is that the infrastructure and the democratic institutions of Israel arise from its connection to the British Empire and Anglo-Saxon institutions, as India's does. And now there is a functioning democracy with a lot of imperfections, but with a wide range of personal freedom. I mean, you can say anything you want to in the state of Israel. You have that personal freedom. And so that's quite an achievement, certainly for a part of the world where there are very few functioning liberal democracies. It has molded an incredible economy. An economy that has raised the standard of living of at least half the Israeli people, or most of the Israeli people, to European standards. The standard of living in Israel may now be, for the middle class, higher than that in Great Britain. So the ascetic, poor economy that was talked about in 1948 is not any longer what's happening in Tel Aviv or in Haifa. It has produced, for its size, a formidable army. There are other countries that have produced formidable armies that are small. North Korea, Taiwan, I mean, they're little countries, but they have what? Very powerful military establishments. They've had to. And certainly Israel. And in fact, without that military establishment, the American alliance would never have taken place. It is the astounding character of the Israeli military that has been one of the foundations of the alliance. It has been able to forge an alliance with the most powerful nation in the world, the United States of America, and maintain it. And without that alliance, it is highly doubtful that despite its arms, that the state of Israel would have survived. And despite its size, and I said this at the very beginning, it has managed to be on the front page, no, of most newspapers. Think of all the other countries in the world that are bigger. Colombia, Venezuela, whatever, I mean, you know, Portugal. I mean, it's not on the front page. They're on the front page continuously. Now, the state of Israel between 1932, 16 years before independence, and 1977 was governed by an establishment. And in order to understand Netanyahu, you have to understand that establishment. That establishment was created by European Jews, and to some degree, people who fancied themselves at the time to be socialistic. It was overwhelmingly secular. That is, the founding establishment of the Jewish state was not religious. They viewed their Jewishness to be primarily a matter of nationality. And they created two institutions which became the source of their leaders. One were socialist communes called kibbutzim, and from the kibbutzim came the officer corps of the Israeli army, ironically. And the second was a powerful labor union called the Histadrut, which had to do what labor unions in other parts of the world never had to do. Since there was no industry in Israel and there was no investment, the labor union had to create the factories for its own workers. So it ended up being both the manager and the representative of the workers. It's a very odd position. And simultaneously it provided welfare services. In fact, the Kupat Cholim, for many, many years, the Israeli health services were under the control not of the government, but of the labor unions, the Histadrut. The establishment was featured in a political party created by these people. It's called the Labor Party. And the great figure of the Labor Party who was there 50 years ago on May 14th, 1948, on a balcony in Tel Aviv, announcing the state of Israel, was David Ben-Gurion. And then there were the other labor regulars. I mean, he was followed ultimately. There was Moshe Sharet for a short time, but Levi Eshkol, and then there was Golda. Oh, there's a labor star. Golda Meir. All right. And Yitzhak Rabin was also part of that labor establishment. Most of the intellectuals and artists in Israel who were of European origin supported the Labor Party. So if you were sitting at a very chic, whatever it was, with intellectuals or artists, they liked the establishment, they liked the party. And also part of the establishment was the officer corps of the army. The officer corps of the army voted the Labor Party because the officer corps was drawn from that sector of the economy, the kibbutzim, which were attached to the Labor Party. In most countries, the officer corps is attached to the what? The conservative side. The right wing, we always say, the reactionaries. That was not true in Israel. However, every establishment breeds its own opposition. And anybody who's been in a family knows that. Once you've decided to be a parent, you now develop an opposition called children. No, no, but it's inevitable. That's what happens in life. They may not be a permanent opposition, but it's part of the growing up process. In the end, the establishment is the one that owns all the privileges. And these people who saw themselves as victims of persecution now were in charge of their own country. They were an establishment. They had power. And one of the interesting things about power, and people don't understand it, I see the change. Give people power and their whole persona changes. From being calm and kind and nice, all of a sudden they feel, right, it happens to all of us. Nobody can be self-righteous. Do you understand? Power does corrupt in some way. And that's why you continuously have political change, because power does that to people. So it aroused an opposition. The first opposition was the people they didn't want. The Israeli establishment wanted the Jews of America to pick themselves up and move. They were their relatives. But why should they move? They had no reason to move. They had no reason to go. I mean, they were living in a free country. The people that wanted to move were the people who were in dire straits because the state of Israel had been established. They lived in the Arab world. And now their lives were impossible. So they fled from Egypt, from Iraq, from Syria, from Libya. I mean, they all came, and they didn't look like anybody from the Labor Party knew. They were Jewish, but they just didn't look like the people they had known back in Europe, in Minsk and Pinsk and who knows where. They just didn't look like them at all. So they now were in charge of these people. And yes, they rescued them. And yes, they fed them, and yes, they trained them. But then they treated them as an inferior class for a long period of time. Now, these Eastern Jews are often called Sephardim. It's a misnomer because Sephardim are technically Spanish Jews. They didn't come from Spain. But these Sephardim, or these Eastern Jews, bore great resentment against the labor establishment, and that was ironic. They were the poor, and the labor establishment were the socialists. One of the peculiarities of Israeli culture is that the richest people in the country vote labor. Because they got there first, they have the power, and they made it, and now they've moved from Tel Aviv to the Bloomfield Hills of Tel Aviv, Herzliya, and there they are. And they had for a long while minimum contact with all these people from, you understand, the Arab countries who came, who moved into South Tel Aviv, which became a kind of slum, and to other communities. And so now you have a population with a grievance. They don't like labor. And while they should be the first people because they're poor to champion socialism, because the establishment is socialist, they hate it. They're open, by the way, to something that we have in America. When you don't like liberal intellectuals, but you're poor, you find people like George Wallace and Huey Long. They're called populists, all right? They don't like rich establishments, and they don't like those fancy intellectuals who talk social. They don't like them. They're American, or they are really the true Israeli. Well, the second opposition group were the people who never came over at all at the beginning because they believed that Israel was a non-kosher state. It was run by secular Jews who often ate ham sandwiches. And therefore they wouldn't come over. There were some who came over, but not many. No Israeli official would be seen with a yarmulke or a kippah or anything like that. They were thoroughly secular. They were the Orthodox. But after the victory in the Six-Day War, and now the new territories contained all the sacred shrines that the Orthodox wanted, because they were mentioned in the Bible, they began to pour into the state. And like most religious groups, their birth rate is much higher than that of intellectuals and artists, you may have noticed. I mean, intellectuals and artists don't have time for child rearing. They're at the symphony, they're at the opera, they don't have time for any of this thing. So they now pour in to the state, and they hate the labor establishment. Because the labor establishment doesn't like these people. The ultra-Orthodox sector of the religious, in fact, dress in a costume. They're called the Black Hats. The Black Hats. And their costume is against what we call the Sabra costume, the costume of the Israeli pioneer. Remember, kind of a little hat, upside-down cup, and a T-shirt and shorts, you know, and whatever else it is. The whole image was entirely different. And then the Labor Party, responding to the collapse of communism and wanting to find a counterforce to these Eastern Jews and the Orthodox, are delighted when they hear that the doors of Russia are open, because Russia contains European Jews, just like the Jews of the labor establishment, and they're all secular. After 70 years of state socialism, and now they're going to come in and they're going to be the what? The counterforce. So they arrive. But they're a very well-educated group. They're not like the Eastern Jews. They're loaded with doctors, loaded with accountants, loaded with dentists, the whole thing. And, I mean, how many doctors can you accommodate in one block? I mean, sometimes in sympathy, people would get sick in Israel just so they could accommodate one of these refugees. So they were left unemployed. And the labor establishment's response to them, to some degree, as they viewed it, was not sympathetic. But they also came with a hatred. They hated communism and they hated socialism. And the Labor Party, in their mind, although the leaders of the party lived in Herzliya, I mean, you know, they're living in Bloomfield Hills, in their mind was a what? A socialist party. So the 750,000, the 800,000 Russian Jews who came into the country, instead of supporting the Labor Party, turned into an opposition group. They didn't have any jobs. And then another group appeared. Among the Orthodox, who initially overwhelmingly refused to serve in the Israeli armed forces because it was not the army of God, there now arose, after 1967, an Orthodox group that came to accept the state of Israel and had a mission. They were called Gush Emunim, and their mission was to go into the West Bank and create settlements so that this land would never, never, never be returned to the Arabs. And now there are 161,000 of them, most of them are Gush Emunim, living in the West Bank. And they're militant. And they believe that any Israeli government that would have them move is illegitimate. And therefore one is justified in civil disobedience, right? In rebelling against that government. And they don't like the labor establishment. All right. And then there's this political party called the Likud that came to power in 1977 because Eastern Jews and Orthodox, the Russians weren't there, and the beginning of the settlers united against the labor establishment and overthrew them and took power under the leadership of Menachem Begin. And that Likud party basically held on to power with a few exceptions until 1992, when Yitzhak Rabin came back with his new policy saying we have to make an accommodation with the Americans and Israel's being destroyed by this continuous war. Well, all of these people hate the labor establishment. Their grievances have nothing at all to do with peace. They have to do, to understand, with old arguments, old family arguments that are not resolved. And so, Yitzhak Shamir, the successor to Menachem Begin, lost. And now, in 1996, after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Bibi Netanyahu comes to power. And Netanyahu comes to power despite the assassination because he feeds on the grievances of all these people and he's pasted them together. Now, the Likud, the coalition today in Israel that supports Netanyahu, is a little bit like the old Democratic Party under Roosevelt when you had Southern whites and blacks in the same party, and it's like the Republicans today where you have what? Economic liberals, they want free trade, no government interference, and the Christian right in the same party. So he's pasted together this party, and he stays in power. There have been many scandals. I don't have to go through all the scandals. He stays in power. He maintains his majority in the Knesset, in the parliament. So let me try to explain why. It's the source of his power. There is a new majority in Israel. It's not the old majority that was there in 1948. It's not the European Jews. It's not the people who vote labor. At one time, they were the overwhelming majority. The new majority consists of Eastern Jews and Orthodox Jews. If you put them together, you've got a what? You've got a majority. And the labor establishment cannot take power anymore on the basis of controlling the overwhelming majority of the people of Israel. There has been a demographic and population change, and Netanyahu governs the new majority. There's a new coalition. The coalition is interesting. There is the Eastern Jews and their representatives. And there are the Orthodox parties, okay. And they were together even under Begin and Shamir. But the new were the Russians. Sharansky, the great hero. The Labor Party expected that the Russians, because they were secular, would support the labor establishment. They represent 750,000, 800,000 people in the state of Israel. But you have to understand, they hate the labor establishment. They came to the country and they felt they were not adequately utilized, and now they're getting their revenge. Politically and economically. Because the only way that Israel can survive is to turn to high tech. Nobody needs Israeli oranges. They're making oranges everywhere. They got in Spain, they got in Italy, Greece, they got oranges all over the place. Jaffa oranges out. They don't need Israel to make textiles. The textile factories in Israel are closing. The ones created by the Union, they're closing because Israeli textiles can't compete with textiles being manufactured more cheaply and better in other places. You can't compare Israeli textiles to textiles coming from Italy, from Prato, from other. Not the same ball game. It's now a global economy. Closing. High tech needs people who know mathematics, in many cases well educated. Oh. So here's this group of people who arrived, and people said, we're glad you're here, but don't bother us about jobs. Who now can move into the new tech, because the kid who was raised on the kibbutz can do oranges, but he can't do high tech. But the Russian Jews who went to what? This academy and that academy and this academy, they can do high tech. So they're just jumping over into the new economy. And in fact, there is a new economy. Bibi Netanyahu has repudiated socialism entirely. He intends to privatize most of the public sector. He has just announced, it's a big step for Israel, that the Israel currency will float freely in the open market. Now before they used to give you a fixed exchange rate, which wasn't what? Really the truth. You get that if you're a tourist and you travel around, they give you these fixed exchange rates that don't really correspond to the value. Then there are other people on the street who give you the real value. All right. Now open confidence in the shekel. The part of the economy that is growing, that is producing prosperity, although there have been problems recently because of the close down of relationships with the Arab world, is the high tech. So Israel could see itself as a kind of high tech center in the Middle East, and its contact with other places, the Silicon Valley in America, Texas, whatever else it is very intimate now. It's a very good way to use Israeli brain power. The other major thing about the new economy is that because of the Intifada, Netanyahu doesn't let Palestinians into the country to work from the West Bank easily. And they have replaced them with 400,000 foreign workers who come from Europe. A lot of them are Romanians, some of them are Bulgarians, a few are Koreans from Asia and Filipinos from Asia and so forth. So this whole new country, if you go to South Tel Aviv, they're all there without wives. I'm going to tell you, what's happening in South Tel Aviv is very interesting. It's workers arriving without families, but they're now doing the menial work that many of the Eastern Jews will no longer. I mean, you're into an entirely new economy. You might as well just flush the word socialism down the toilet. It's gone. Even the kibbutzim are turning basically into stockholder corporations for people who like to live out in the country. Okay. There's a new army. Now the Gush Emunim are part of the Orthodox that will serve in the army. You will see many, many people in the army now who wear the what? The kippah or the yarmulke and so forth, but they are in many cases what? Fanatic about their zeal. And will they obey their officers? If indeed there is an Israeli withdrawal ordered by the government. You have, by the way, supporting this whole system of Netanyahu, the settlers who will not budge. And Netanyahu said to Clinton, I can't give you the 13% of the West Bank you're asking for it because the roads connecting the settlements, you do understand, to Israel proper will be lost. We can't turn those roads over to Palestinians. And he stays in power because Israelis mumble and grumble about the scandals. Yes, they would like another prime minister, but they're ambivalent about the peace process, many of them, and so he stays in power, and so he offers resistance, and Netanyahu has developed a strategy. His strategy for beating Bill Clinton and the American government. So now let me give you his strategy. Now, does he do exercise in the morning? I don't know, but I mean, all right. Strategy one, find another ally in the Middle East who is also aggrieved against the Americans and who also dislikes the Arabs, is a kind of security. He's found it. In Turkey, the army in Turkey, which is overwhelmingly secular, overthrew the fundamentalist prime minister and took over. And now there is an intimate alliance between Israel and Turkey. And Turkey is a little alienated from the United States of America because she wanted to get into the European economic market, and the Americans didn't help her get in. The Europeans don't want any more Turks living in Germany. So the Turks are a little bit miffed, and now they also fear the rise of Arab power. And so Turkey and Israel, that's one of his strategies. So when people say, we've alienated the Arab world, don't worry. There's 60 million people in Turkey, and Turkey is our firm ally. Okay. Second, he has declared his independence of the United States of America. America gives over $3 billion a year to the state of Israel, a very large donation, and he says, we don't want any more civilian aid, just military aid. Now, we want the military aid increased by $600 million. The civilian aid was $1.2 billion. The military aid was $1.8 billion. And so get rid of the civilian, but still $600 million less. What he's basically saying is, if the price of our dependence on the United States of America is that we will be humiliated, we don't want the money our economy is making. Oh, boy. It's called in Greek chutzpah. Okay. Third, he arrives in America, and before he sees Bill Clinton, the last time he goes to see Jerry Falwell. Oh. Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson have troops, and they have a lot of what? Influence. And what he's saying to Bill Clinton is, you tangle with me and what? I'm going to talk to your enemies, and they've all now denounced the policies of the American government against the state of Israel. His fourth strategy is, since the Christian right has connection with the Republican Party, and the Republican Party would like to humiliate the Clinton administration, although the Republican Party initiated this new policy. Now, the members of Congress have all been contacted, and in the Senate, 81 senators concerned about votes back home have now proclaimed their support for Netanyahu, and they told Clinton to stop pushing Netanyahu around. Oh, don't tangle with Bibi. And now he turns to the American Jewish leadership, and he says, whether you agree with me or don't, and polls have indicated that close to 80% of American Jews don't agree with Netanyahu. But his reply to them is the following: we're under siege, and division among Jews will only encourage our enemies. Oh. So now a large part of the American Jewish leadership, which secretly disagrees with Netanyahu's policy, is now complaining about the way Clinton's treating Netanyahu. And they're heavy supporters, certainly, of the Democratic Party. One of his strategies is to say to Arafat, we want peace, but only if you also make concessions. So we want you to control all your terrorists. Oh. So Arafat does he arrests these people, and he can't control all it's like asking Netanyahu to control all his fanatics. And once you have one slip up, Netanyahu, you see? They don't make any concessions. And last, he holds up Iraq. The Clinton administration is busy trying to contain Iraq, and Saddam Hussein seems to be growing in power, feeding on the failure of the peace process in Israel, picking up allies all over the place. And Netanyahu says, you're going to lose those Arab allies, but you can always what? Count on me. So what does it all mean? Well, you can see what it means. There's a stalemate. Madeleine Albright says, Did I issue an ultimatum to Netanyahu? No, I'm not that kind of a person. I don't issue ultimatums at all. I simply suggested to him that he ought to consider withdrawing 13. We're not pushing him at all. Do you see his, and this man is what? Is skillful. The American government has backed down. They've lied. They did issue an ultimatum. They said within a few days, we want you to withdraw. We want this peace process to be revived. And it can only be revived. We want you to surrender 13% of the West Bank in conformity with part of the original plan. And he said no. And then Clinton backed down. He has a lot of problems to deal with. I mentioned that last week. And Madeleine Albright, Miss Tuffy, she backed down. One of the implications is the American government is totally frustrated. They're frustrated by a Republican Congress that initiated this policy. It was the Republicans who initiated this policy. And now they're playing politics. And Clinton is there holding the ball or whatever else it is, trying to apply pressure. And now it is very clear who has power. Netanyahu has arrived in this country. He will go and speak to Congress. He will speak to the Christian right. He will mobilize the enemies of the Clinton administration. One of the implications is, of course, that the Palestinians aren't going to sit idly by. If indeed nothing happens, the next year when the things should have been finalized, even though Arafat only has the Gaza Strip, basically, and has no connection to the Palestinian cities in the West Bank unless he goes through Israeli territory, it's very clear he will unilaterally declare a Palestinian state. And if he does, he will no longer be subject to the provisions of the peace treaty. He can then take whatever arms he wants. Will the Israeli army then invade Gaza? This thing is, it isn't that the Palestinians will be still. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein is sailing. He's got all these European powers now in favor of lifting the sanctions. And now all over the Arab world, as the peace process fails, he says, you see, you trusted those moderate leaders, Hussein in Jordan and Mubarak in Egypt, and they failed you. So his popularity is what? Growing. No, he's getting more popular. So what you have now in the Middle East, since American pressure on Israel is like stymied, what you have is a vacuum. It's like a power. It's like a political vacuum. The American policy cannot be completed. And now there is this confrontation. So obviously, there's only one way to resolve it. The only people who can remove Bibi Netanyahu from office are the Israeli people. That's it. It's quite possible that there might be a couple more defections. He now only hangs on to 61 out of 120 in the Knesset. Couple defections, and he'll have to call an election. And if he calls an election, it's not clear that the Israeli people will repudiate him. But the decision is no longer in Washington. Bibi Netanyahu has mobilized his forces. The decision is now in Jerusalem, or it's in Israel. And if the Israeli people sustain Netanyahu in power, then the consequence is going to be a continuing confrontation with the American government and within the American political scene, over this issue, and with a deteriorating political situation, while the high-tech sector certainly may what? May flourish in some way, but it's very, very unstable. And therefore, the new policy of the United States of America, which is to arrange for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, is now stymied. And the only people in the world who can basically right now untie the thing, all right, is the Israeli public. Well, thank you very, very much.